Lecture 7, Light and Color. Perspective, which we talked about in the last chapter, is just one way in which artists suggest space. Another way is through the use of light. In 1666, Sir Isaac Newton demonstrated that some surfaces appear to be certain colors because they absorb and reflect different wavelengths of light. An object that appears yellow-green has absorbed all other colors of light and reflects only the yellow-green. Color is essential for defining shape and mass. We see the red object against the green one. People who are colorblind cannot often differentiate between certain color wavelengths and cannot read the numbers in the image you see on the screen now, which is part of a test for color deficiency. Because they often read different colors of similar light and darkness as the same, they see things different spatially. This demonstrates how color and light are important to our perception of space. So again, if we look at this green circle, it's a kind of olive green circle with various degrees of light and dark green in this circle. And then in the center of the circle, you should see kind of a magenta number 3. And if you don't, you probably have some color deficiency issues. Additionally, there's a number 8 that's kind of overlapping with the number 3. And the number 8, what separates the 3 from the 8, because they overlap, is just kind of an orange, kind of slightly orangish kind of bit of circles there. There's only about 10 or 15 orange circles. So anyway, you're looking at one of the many plates for the color deficiency test. And this points out to us that color is an important component in our visual environment. We're going to start off this discussion of light and color by, well, let's look at an architect who uses light in his work. This is an interior view of an important chapel that's in France, and it's made by an important modernist architect named Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier's building is an exciting place for worship, spiritual development and worship, a church. But if you look at these really thick walls, you'll notice that the windows are very, very small on the outside of the building, and then as they come through the very, very thick wall, the windows get wider, and this lets in a very, very diffused kind of indirect light. And this indirect light really kind of defines the spiritual essence of the building in question. So really, it's a contemporary building that has a very spiritual overall feeling. So since natural light helps to define spatial relationships, it stands to reason that artists are interested in manipulating light, natural light. And this is true for architects who have the opportunity to work with natural light. One of the most dramatically lit spaces, again, is this piece of architecture made by Le Corbusier, the Church for Notre Dame de Haute at Ronchamp in eastern France. Again, light is admitted through these very narrow stained glass windows on the outside of the church, but as these window boxes expand through the very, very thick walls, the light broadens into these wide shafts, and they do possess an unmistakably spiritual quality. This is an example again of how the artist has designed the space to inform the viewers of what's happening inside the space. If you go there to pray or to deal with your spiritual self, I think this really subtle inundation of colored light sets an atmosphere that I think would be linked to spirituality. So it's a pretty exciting place. Here's the basic study guide for Chapter 7, Lecture 7, Light and Color. I've got 2 study guides set up today. This one shows us the 7 or 8 or 9, I guess 8, the 8 primary topics we'll be talking about today. And then the next page will give you real specific subcategories. We're going to again talk about atmospheric perspective, chiaroscuro, hatching and cross-hatching, and value. And those 4 first terms have to do with light, but not necessarily color. And then we move on to the basic color vocabulary, color schemes, color in representational art, and then the symbolic uses of color. So again, the first four categories more or less refer to light, although they include color, but they're specific to light, the degree of lightness or darkness in a thing. And then the bottom four are more specific and more unique to color, although both of these terms, light and color, really are synonymous for the most part in understanding and discussing visual art. Here's a far more comprehensive list of the terms we're going to have discussed in today's lecture. And you can use these as a skeleton for your note taking as you prepare for the lecture ahead. I'm not going to stop and go over each one of these terms right now because that really will be the next, I guess 45 minutes or an hour. The next lecture, the whole lecture is going to cover these terms. You have the opportunity to rewind and go back and write these down, and I think these can help you, again, be kind of a skeleton for your note taking. At the end of the chapter, you should know what each of these terms mean, where they fit into the textbook and into the course, and then you'll be in good shape for the quiz as well as the exams. So again, this is a study guide for you all. This is a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. We've seen his Last Supper, and now we're looking at a painting called Madonna of the Rocks. This is a great example of atmospheric perspective. For da Vinci, light was at least as important to the rendering of space as linear perspective. Again, we saw his Last Supper painting where we talked about one-point linear perspective. Well, here's another one of his works of art, and this does not have linear perspective per se because it has no orthogonal lines, no architecture, no kind of exposed grid, but a very organic situation. And what you can see going on here is something that we call atmospheric perspective. In other words, the deep space presented in this painting is not done through a vanishing point per se, but rather it's done through another bunch of painter's devices. And again, it's called atmospheric perspective, and I'm going to explain what that is. So, the effect of the atmosphere on the appearance of the elements of the landscape was a prime concern to da Vinci, and through painting from life, he formulated these rules, the rules of atmospheric perspective. He felt that atmospheric perspective takes into account the manner or quality of which the atmosphere affects objects that are nearer or farther away from you. Da Vinci observed, along with a bunch of other painters at the time, that objects farther away from you appear less distinct, they're cooler or bluer in color, and they have reduced contrast. So, in Da Vinci's Madonna on the Rocks, the foreground objects are painted with a clarity and definition, and it enables us to separate them spatially from the hazier, distant rock formations in the back. If you look way, way in the rear of this painting, you'll see things getting cooler and hazier and less crisp, and then we know they're further away. Again, perhaps as a viewer, it just looks ordinary or the way it should be. But in order for an artist to make a work of art that appears the way it should be, they have to study nature and go outside and look into the distance and figure all this stuff out. And Da Vinci's done that here in this painting, Madonna of the Rocks, which shows us his understanding of atmospheric perspective, a way of organizing deep space without linear perspective, without lines and vanishing points, but rather by using color shifts and kind of a hazier focus on the objects that they paint, so that we know that Jesus and his mother and it's John the Baptist in the foreground are closer to us than the things in the background. So that's the 16th century. The Da Vinci painting is the 16th century, the Renaissance. By the 19th century, atmospheric perspective has come to dominate the thinking of landscape painters in a really big way. Here we see Turner, who's a leading expert in the field of linear perspective. So he knows how to paint linear perspective really well. Yet he's always been more interested in atmospheric perspective because he just feels it's a more expressive tool for the painter. So in this work called Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway, Turner has used paint in a manner which causes light and atmosphere to completely dominate the scene, overwhelming any reference to linear perspective. In part, Turner felt that linear perspective could be used to describe physical reality, but he was trying through atmospheric perspective to show us a greater spiritual reality. So if you look at this painting, um, perhaps you can see there's a little, in the left-hand lower corner. There's a little rowboat out there in the water, and then above that little rowboat, there's a causeway with some arches that seem to go horizontally from left to right across the painting. And then by the time they get just beyond midway, the causeway turns coming towards us, and now we see a roaring locomotive coming right at us, right to the lower right-hand corner of the painting. And then it's a foggy day. The clouds above are hazy. The mist off the water is evident. And Turner is again more interested in painting the atmosphere of the thing than he is in painting the rigid precision of it. So he's really trying to show you very expressively the atmosphere of the thing, and any sense of space and depth achieved in this painting, we would say, is through atmospheric perspective. Here's Rembrandt's The Mill, another painting that shows us a great play with light and dark, and we see atmospheric perspective at play as well. Turner was a fan of this painting, which came 150 years before his work, and what he learned from it and what he loved about this painting by Rembrandt was how, again, we're kind of trying to move beyond the limitations of just linear perspective, and this thing called atmospheric perspective. Turner and Rembrandt and many advocates of Da Vinci, advocates of atmospheric perspective, feel that it presents a more spiritual sense of depth in space. And you can see again how rich the blues are in the sky at the very top of the painting, and as those blues move towards the horizon line, they become fainter and less focused and less distinct, um, really setting up this again the sense of deep space done entirely through light and color, and not at all through vanishing points and orthogonal lines and diagonal recession and all the things we studied in the last chapter. So, again, another example of atmospheric perspective, which is a deep space presented through uh, a manipulation of light, shade, and color. Chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is a real art appreciation, artistry word. You don't use it in normal conversation, and perhaps if you're ever on Jeopardy, it'll be a question in artistry category. A primary tool of artists of the Renaissance to render the effects of light is this thing called chiaroscuro. In Italian, the word chiaro means light, and oscuro means dark. So this light-dark phenomenon, the light-dark phenomenon, when carefully employed, produces the effects of a three-dimensional surface on a two-dimensional page. So this process is called modeling. When you draw on a piece of paper and create a three-dimensional modeled surface, you're modeling form on the page. Chiaroscuro can be readily observed when an artist works on a colored or gray sheet of paper, as you see here, and then exaggerates the highlights with white chalk and the shadows and shading with a darker chalk. So again, um, in this example by Proudhon, which is a drawing for La Source, the highlights are indicated by the white chalk, which define the area where the light source hits the subject directly. And then there are the three basic areas of shadow, the penumbra, which is the transition to the umbra, or the core of the shadow, and then the cast shadow, the darkest area of the shadow. Um, this was a bluish-gray sheet of paper, and that would be the field, or the ground. And then the artist took two kinds of chalk, a white chalk and a darker black chalk, and made this whole very, very well modeled figure drawing come to life. And the figure seems as if she is just popping off the page um, because of his high degree of modeling and because he's employing this thing called chiaroscuro, this effect of the play of light and dark. If you look at the woman's legs, they really feel very volumetric and cylindrical because he's employing a degree of shading from white to gray to black. And all of that is what we call um, modeling the form. It includes highlights and shadows and whatnot. And this overall art history term is called chiaroscuro, rendering the effects of light and dark. I've jumped out of the sequence of your book to this piece by Artemisia Gentileschi's. It's called "The Judith and Maidservant with the Head of Holofernes." It's a wonderful painting. It shows her mastery of the technique of chiaroscuro, and it takes it perhaps to a new level. And when you have a really theatrical use of light and shade, uh, with extreme highlights and extreme shadows, extreme lights and extreme darks, we call this extreme level of chiaroscuro. We call this tenebrism. It's from the Italian word tenebroso, meaning murky. And this is demonstrated through the dramatic spots of light, again, that appear against the very deep shadows of the painting. Here, if you look at the woman with the sword's arm, you see a very white highlight, and then it quickly turns into a black highlight, almost theatrically, like there's a spotlight hitting these two figures. And that, of course, leads me to discuss the subject of the painting. It's called Judith and Maidservant with the Head of Holofernes. It's made in 1625 by a woman artist, by Artemisia Gentileschi, and it's a fascinating Old Testament story, which I'll tell you. It's a story of this woman, Judith, and her maidservant, who their village or their community has under siege by Holofernes, a powerful warlord, and he is going to sack the village. And Judith says, "Well, before you do that, why don't we have a discussion?" And Holofernes wants to take Judith's honor. He wants to have his way with her, sleep with her. He meets with her, and they have drinks, and she knocks him over the head and then cuts his head off. If you look at the bottom of the painting, she's stuffing the maidservant, her assistant, her maid, is stuffing the head of this warlord ruler into a bag, while Judith is looking to see who's coming, and she still has the sword in her hand that she used to behead this warlord. So she saves her people, and Judith becomes a savior of her community, because she doesn't give up her virtue, and in fact she kills and cuts off the head of the bad guy, sticks it in the bag, and then the bad guys retreat, and her people are saved. In the year 1625, there weren't that many celebrated female artists, so this painting also becomes kind of a great narrative painting for feminism and for women's rights, and to show that the woman, who certainly in the 17th century might have been considered a less effective and the weaker of the two sexes, but in some cases, especially this case, the woman is independent and very powerful and capable of not only taking care of herself, but solving the problems for her whole community. So it's also kind of this wonderful underdog story of this woman who gets the job done. The Judith and the maidservant. And there's lots and lots of paintings throughout our history that celebrate this subject. We're seeing it here again because the impact of this whole scene is heightened through this thing called tenebrism, which is this extreme kind of chiaroscuro. The use of light that seems almost as if a spotlight is there, and that curtain that we see, that blue curtain in the upper right hand corner, it's kind of just been pulled back, and Judith has got her hand out there to kind of keep the light out of her eyes, because she just knocked somebody over the head and cut their head off. I mean, she's just murdered someone who was going to murder her people. So again, a complicated narrative story where light and chiaroscuro, and then this extreme kind of chiaroscuro called tenebrism, really help make the scene more dramatic and more exciting. Here we see a sphere represented by means of modeling. And if you were an art student and you were learning how to draw some of the simple geometric shapes like cubes and spheres and cones and cylinders and pyramids, which is what we do in the art department, at the introductory level, we learn how to draw. You would start to understand these kind of things with highlight and shadow and reflected shadow and whatnot. But again, that's a circle that has been modeled to look like a sphere. I say it's a circle because it's a two-dimensional shape on a two-dimensional sheet of paper. But the illusion here is of it being a sphere and it being modeled, highly modeled. Another way to express light and shade on a page, especially in drawing, is through hatching and cross-hatching. When you put a series of parallel lines together, or just, yeah, that's called hatching, a series of parallel lines together, you get hatching. And then when those lines cross, you get cross-hatching. And for Mary Cassatt to make this drawing, the coiffure, she has put together a lot of lines. And what I want to point out for you in this painting is that to get a darker area, she has a greater concentration of lines. The lines in the lighter areas, it's just a blank field. But then in the slightly gray areas, we see a concentration of lines. And then in the very darkest areas, to get the rich, close to blackness, she has lines going in many, many directions, overlapping one another. And that's hatching and cross-hatching. Here's Michelangelo da Vinci. Well, here's Michelangelo and his pen and ink drawing, the head of a satyr. And if you look carefully again, we see this technique of hatching and cross-hatching once again. Hatching is an area of closely spaced parallel lines, or hatches, and the closer the spacing between the lines becomes, the darker the area. You see hatching in this drawing by Michelangelo, um, and then you see cross-hatching when he gets those dark, dark, dark areas. Let's look. Let's try to pick an area. Well, under the subject's eye, you see kind of a white highlight. That's just a field of highlight. But then right beneath it, you see a very dark shadow to make the cheekbone really stick out there. Well, down below there, there's quite a bit of cross-hatching. Yet other areas where we see just a simple kind of a middle gray, it's just hatching. So again, it's degrees of hatching and cross-hatching. And of course, it's not a computer who made this drawing. It's done uh, by Michelangelo, the creative Renaissance genius, the painter, the architect, the sculptor. So he's also putting contour lines in and outlines in it, and a variety of line types. But by and large, he's modeled this form to give it a sense of three-dimensional volume, because of course it's only a two-dimensional page. But to give it a sense of three-dimensional volume, he's using areas of hatching and cross-hatching to create areas of very, very dark fields, and then all those subtle areas between um, highlights and blackness. The grayscale. So the gradual shift from light to dark that characterized chiaroscuro and atmospheric perspective and tenebrism, this shift from white, white, white to black, 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 from very, very bright to very, very dark, is called the grayscale, or the key, or the value scale. Anyway, the gradual shift from light to dark that characterizes both chiaroscuro and atmospheric perspective are illustrated in the grayscale. The lighter area is um, more light filled or higher in value, and the darker area is lower in value and becomes black. Um, so we'll talk about these as they affect both light, but also as they affect color. Pat Steer, the woman who made the autographic line drawings in a couple of chapters ago, she's made these paintings as well, and pointing out for us that colors too change in key or value similarly to just gray. So light pink is high in value, and dark maroon is low in value, but they're each derived from the color red. We're going to look at two paintings by Pat Steer, or two triptychs, two sets of three paintings. The first one called Pink Chrysanthemums, the next one called Night Chrysanthemums. In this one, Pat Steer has taken the same color, red. Red is the color, or the hue of both sets of paintings. This one and the slide we'll see next. But in this one, Pat Steer has added white to red to get this lighter color, which we call a tint. Again, when you add white to a color, when you add white to a hue, you create a tint. And the addition of black to a color creates a shade. So here Pat Steer in this pink chrysanthemum has added simply white to the hue of red to make this color scheme. Let's look at the next work. Here, she's added black to the color red, to the hue of red, and she's created a shade. So if you add white to a color, you get a tint. If you add black to a color, you get a shade. Both of these changes heighten the expressive impact of the work of art. In the lighter panel, the change from higher to lower value becomes increasingly energetic and alive, while in this darker night chrysanthemum, the mood becomes maybe somber and perhaps more threatening or forbidden than the previous work. We saw the Mary Cassatt painting of the Coffier a few minutes ago. I'm sorry, we saw the drawing by Mary Cassatt, the Coffier, which showed us hatching and cross-hatching. Now we're going to look at a drawing and then a painting by Mary Cassatt. And the drawing and painting are called, this is the study for the painting. The painting is called In the Loge. And a loge is those little box seats, those little private kind of booths that you would find at an opera or a kind of a fancy opera theater. So, Mary Cassatt's In the Loge is a study, we see the study here, which shows us a contrast between light and dark. And this becomes evident when we compare the final work with this tiny sketch. We'll start with the tiny sketch. It's a study perhaps made at the scene itself. Perhaps Mary Cassatt made this sketch while she was herself sitting at the opera. In the sketch, Mary Cassatt divides the work diagonally into two broad zones. The top left bathed in light and the lower right dominated by the woman's black dress. This diagonal design is softened by Cassatt's decision to fit her figure into the architectural curve of the loge itself, so that the line running along the railing, then up her arm, continues around the line created by the hat and its strap in a gigantic kind of a compositional arch. Thus, the woman's face falls into the zone of light, highlighted by her single diamond earring and cradled as if it were in black. So again, preparatory study here, where we see this composition being considered, probably done at the actual opera. Now let's have a look at the painting. And again, in the finished painting, the strict division between light and dark has been modified by the revelation of the woman's neck and her collar, creating two strong light and dark diagonals. And this angularity emphasizes the horizontal quality of her profile and gaze as she stares out at the other loges through her binoculars. Across the way, a gentleman leans forward out of his box to stare through his own binoculars at this woman in black. He is in the zone of highlight, and this dramatic division between light and dark defines itself as a division perhaps between the male and the female spaces. Cassatt has used light and dark to define compositional structure and perhaps to add an element of intrigue to this work. Again, the subject of this painting, who's in the darkness, that diagonal darkness, is staring out at something. Perhaps she's watching the opera. Perhaps she's staring into another opera box. But then we see that bald gentleman in his tuxedo in the back staring right at us, staring right at the subject here. So we've got kind of this nice play between who's doing what and what's going on. Apparently, these opera boxes, in the 18th and 19th century, and perhaps today, are really fancy seats, but they're not so much designed for you to have a better view of the performance as they are designed for the audience to have a very nice view of you. So it's kind of a who's who, kind of like the modern corporate box at a stadium. It's kind of being in there gives you a kind of status. Judith and the Maidservant, the painting falls into this section of your book, so I just left it there so you could kind of see it in order. But again, that division between light and dark becomes so important. And now you all know the story of, and maybe you didn't even notice that green head on the bottom that's being stuffed in the bag. I assume it's green because he's dead and it's starting to rot. Or maybe to signify that he's more of a demon and a monster and doesn't have the righteousness of Judith. Thomas Cole's landscape painting here. We see atmospheric perspective at play, of course. We understand that a little better now. And again, if you look how the blue sky gets less blue and fainter as it gets closer to the horizon. Uh, if you look at the green landscape, you can see how it just becomes hazier and less distinct as it gets to the back. Anyway, um, this is one of those classic American paintings that talks about nature and the landscape, and also about light and dark. About light and dark, and about this divide between kind of good and evil. Um, about this kind of duality between light and dark, about the good of the light and the unknown and bad of dark. Um, from the book of Genesis, we have in the Bible we have this. In the beginning, God created. Here's a quote from Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. So, I'm reading from Genesis, and this is the Old Testament 5,000 years ago, where people associated light with good and dark with bad, and maybe they meant, um, you know, uh, dark is the unknown and light is the known and it's knowable. Um, but whatever it was, artists have really stayed on these really simple, basic premises, and this painting has this divide. On the left side of the painting, we have darkness. On the right side, we have lightness. The left side becomes perhaps a little treacherous and forbidding, and we have that deep green and we don't know what's going on in there exactly. The tree is not so healthy, and it could be a storm. Actually, it could be raining on the far left. And then as we get to the right, suddenly it becomes a more and more sunny day until we get to the far right of the painting where it looks like it's just a paradise, just a healthy valley, a fertile valley full of trees and crops and whatnot. So again, back to Genesis and this 5,000-year-old notion that we have of light being good and dark being bad based on the Word of God. That's a cultural convention we have in the West, and those who recognize the Bible. Not all cultures share that exact theme, and we'll look at some of those works now. Um, this is a wonderfully it's a wonderful piece. It takes a little time to look at it and understand what's going on here. It's called Racing Sideways, and the word race is in quotation marks. Um, race as in uh, the color of your skin, whether you're Caucasian or Asian or African or whatnot. Anyway, in this piece we have racing sideways, and we also have kind of another view of that value study of that shift from white to black. But the play here, of course, is on. We have I think it's about 10 or 15 little figures here jogging, and on the far right, the very far right figure, it looks like a black man jogging in a white jogging suit. And then as we slowly move all the way to the left, it looks like a white man jogging in a black jogging suit. And it's a subtle play as you watch. If nothing else, you can see their costumes, their jogging clothing, shift from black subtly to gray in the middle, and then all the way to white at the end. But while they're shifting, it looks like their skin color, their complexion, their race is shifting in the opposite direction. So we have kind of a more provocative application of the value study where the content, the subject has been shifted to be figurative, and then the content perhaps will allow us to consider the perceptual illusion replicating cultural illusion. We've got the idea of skin color and class color, and we think of white collar employees and blue collar employees. But here, I think Nikolai Buglaj has presented us these 13 racers and how their skin colors change. So it forces us to think about in a kind of a pun the value of light and the value of dark and the value of white and the value of black. And he's playing with some interesting words here. I just read the Genesis thing about light and light being good and dark being bad. Well, obviously this artist is trying to remind us that that doesn't apply to skin color. Blackface and Arm Unit by Ben Jones, 1971. Here's I could read a little poem by Ted Wilson that I think helps us understand this piece. Mighty drums echoing the voices of spirits. These sounds are rhythmic, the rhythm of vitality, the rhythm of exuberance, and the rhythms of life. These are the sounds of blackness. Blackness, the presence of all color. And there's the poem. And here we see these cast life-size hands and arms, and then this complicated decoration and kind of scarification reminiscent of some of the facial decorations from some of the most ancient African sculpture and ancient African cultural tribes. Um, and if nothing else, what we can draw from all this is that different cultures, ethnocentrically, have different understandings and different attitudes about what white and what black mean. We'll learn in a few minutes when we get to some specific color ideas that the presence of all colors creates black. If you mixed all the colors, if you took all your Crayola crayons and you scribbled them on one sheet of paper, in the end you'd have black. So black is again is the presence of all color, and we'll talk about that as we move along. This is the 13th century sculpture, um, African sculpture from Nigeria, made of brass, and it is interesting in that it has these little holes drilled around the forehead there, and that's probably where actual or ceremonial hair was attached to the piece. It was probably used in a specific cultural ceremony. Here's the Nigerian funerary shrine cloth, and I can talk a little bit about this one. The Nigerian funerary shrine cloth further illustrates the limitations of Western assumptions about the meaning of white and black, black and white. The dominant colors of the cloth, red, black, and white, have different connotations than in Western culture. The cloth's black signifies life and the ancestral spirit, and the color white signifies death. The red is meant to inspire the warrior's valorous deeds. Again, back to the ethnocentric. That might not be a traditional read, and certainly nothing you would draw from the Old Testament, where you would hear that God separated the light from the dark, and the light was good, and the dark was bad or evil. Well, that's not the case at all, as we know. Not to say that cultural conventions don't continue. If you refer back to Star Wars, Darth Vader, wears black, and he's the bad guy, you know. But in a lot of old westerns, the sheriff wore a white hat and the bad guy wore a black hat. So we still live on this cultural convention of God separating light from the dark and the light being good and the dark being bad. But I think that's an oversimplification, especially as we become aware and exposed to other cultures and their applications and attitudes. We seem to understand things, I think, a lot better. So we're going to move on to color now. This was a discussion more or less of light, and now we'll move on to some discussion of color. Transient Rainbow by Kai Gu Kwang. And this is a photograph of a spectacular sculpture. A sculpture, a temporary sculpture, kind of a performance piece that spanned the East River in New York City in the year 2002. I'll try to describe the piece. It's a kind of a big firework explosion, a rainbow, a transient, meaning temporary, a transient rainbow, a massive fireworks display that extends across the East River of New York City, connecting Manhattan to Queens. And it was done in June of 2002. Not too long after September 11th, 2001. And maybe in some ways becomes another healing event for the city, which has been devastated by this horrific, terrifying terrorist attack, and the destruction and the human death toll was so horribly high. This was a kind of a healing gesture. New York City's Museum of Modern Art was closing for a renovation, which has since been completed and the museum has been reopened, but it closed for a couple of years to allow for this big renovation project. And they moved to a temporary headquarters, some old factories in Queens. This was an event to kind of signify the museum moving from Manhattan to Queens across the East River, and this wonderful rainbow. Literally, it lasted. I think it lasted 15 seconds. This kind of explosion of rainbow. Um, the artist is Chinese, and the Chinese in Chinese mythology, the rainbow is associated with the goddess Nu Wa, uh, who sealed the broken sky after there was some fight amongst the gods, and she sealed the sky with stones of different colors, becoming the colors of the rainbow. Anyway, this is a incredible spectacle of introducing you to color, literally with this 1 mile firework arch of color. It's just a spectacular piece, which of course it would have been a far different experience for you all to see it in person. But I think you get the point if you know what fireworks look like and the kind of popping and sizzling and the kind of dynamics of it. Pretty spectacular. The next slide shows us something very different. I won't go to the slide just yet. I'll talk about it first because the next slide is drawing for transient rainbow, and I wouldn't call it a drawing for transient rainbow, although the artist does. I would call it drawing from transient rainbow, since it's kind of made after the fact, and it shows us kind of a black and white only kind of burned sheet of paper, gunpowder, which has been exploded to burn onto the sheet of paper, creating the same kind of effect. So remember this piece while we discuss the drawing. Again, here's the drawing for transient rainbow, and I would argue that it's a drawing from transient rainbow. We can say the kind of vanitas quality here, in that this is the kind of the memory of the piece, and this reminds us that something as spectacular as that rainbow couldn't last forever. It only lasted 15 seconds, and now we're left with this kind of fleeting memory of the piece. So again, the piece talks about the fragility and transcendence of the moment, and by extension, the fragility and transcendence of life itself. In black and white, in this print, we see maybe this subject of life and death more clearly, especially if we know about the spectacular, colorful, and very, very brief rainbow that came before it. Let's talk about a basic color vocabulary now. Here's the colors separated by a prism. You see a white light entering the prism, and then it comes out the other end divided into violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red, the visible spectrum. So again, color. Of all the formal elements, color is perhaps the most complex. Individually, we might be able to distinguish between as many as 10 million different colors. 10 million different colors. That's a lot of colors. In New Zealand, the Maori, the indigenous Maori people, have over 100 different words for what most of us would just call red. So in the Mauritian culture, the people there have developed 100 distinct separate words for red, whereas we might just have a few. There's room for incredible complexity. Again, people can distinguish between 10 million different colors. So we're very, very sensitive. Our eyes and our brains are very, very sensitive to looking at and seeing color. This is the basic color vocabulary here. We see sunlight passing through the spectrum, breaks it into bands of different colors, which we call a rainbow, creating a spectrum. By organizing the visible spectrum into a circle, we get the conventional color wheel. I'll go to that next. Here's a conventional color wheel. And this will require on your part a little bit of memorization. In the conventional color wheel, there are three primary colors. The three primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. You must remember that. You must know the three primary colors. I hope and assume that you know them already. The three primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. And these are theoretically the colors which cannot be made by mixing other colors together. You can't make a primary from other colors. Secondary colors, orange, green, and violet, can be made by mixing primary colors. So you mix yellow and blue, and you get green. You mix red and blue, and you get violet. Secondary colors, as their names imply, are colors made not the first colors, they're the second colors, the ones made by mixing the primary colors. And then between secondary colors Uh, After secondaries come tertiary or intermediate colors, which are a combination of secondary and primary colors on either side of it. And that's when you get things like yellow-green and blue-green and blue-violet, etc. They don't have independent names. They just get hyphenated names. But this is pretty important that you know the conventional color wheel. And you must know the three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. Each primary and secondary color in the visible spectrum are called a hue, H-U-E, a hue. Thus, all shades and tints of red, from pink to maroon, are said to be in the same hue. So earlier we saw the Pat Steer paintings of the chrysanthemums, the pink ones and the maroon ones. Well, those are both in the same hue. They're both in the hue of red. Hue is the color category. If it's pink or maroon, it's still in the hue of red. So, again, all shades of red from pink to maroon are still in the same hue. There's two kinds of color, and artists, painters, sculptors, drawers, printmakers, photographers, artists for the most part use subtractive, the subtractive process, and use reflected pigment. So this is what we've been talking about. We've been talking about color mixture through reflected pigment. And this is the subtractive process. And you can see that if you add colors where they overlap, you get the secondary colors, but those colors are also darker. And then when those colors come to the center of this, kind of these three circles stacked together, you get black. So if you add all the colors together in reflected pigment, you get black. So you make black by adding all the colors together in reflected pigment. So if you went to the paint store and you got blue, red, and yellow, and then poured them all together, theoretically you would get liquid paint in black. Um, and that's theoretically how pigments are used to make colors. Um, Black is the absence of all color. So by mixing these together, you get black. Now, I'm going to introduce another kind of color system, and it's kind of the opposite. But it doesn't exist with paint, with liquid paint, or most of the art supplies that artists uses. This is refracted light, and refracted light is the opposite of reflected pigment. Refracted light is what you use if you're a stage designer and you're putting spotlights on an individual. It's also what happens in your computer monitor, because your computer monitor makes color through refracted light. Um, reflected light Refracted light, on the other hand, works in a different manner. The primary colors of reflected light are red, orange, green. I'm sorry, red, orange is one color, green is one color, and blue, violet are another color. So in this manner, these colors overlap to create yellow, magenta, and cyan, which become the secondary colors in refracted light. And then if you add all those colors together, instead of getting black, you get white. Um, so again, refracted light is the kind of color you see on your TV monitor or your computer monitor, or if you were doing stage lighting with spotlights. This is the opposite of um, reflected pigment. They work in very different ways. The majority of our discussion, except for anything that happens on a computer screen, is with the prior um, reflected pigment. This is just to show you that there are two color systems out there in the world. Here's back to Michelangelo. Here's we saw his hatching and cross hatching in the head of a satyr today. Here's the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So color is described first by its hue, and we've talked about that. Hue is the kind of color category. If I asked you to describe a color by its hue, you'd be picking the color that you find on the color wheel that matches the painting, categorically, not specifically. Um, and then so you've got the hue, H-U-E, and then you've got the kind of value. A color can be, you can add white to a color or black to a color, and if you added white to red, you would get pink, and that would be a light value. If you added black to red, you'd get maroon, and that would be a low, darker value. But there's another way of talking about color besides its white or blackness and besides its categorical hue. And the other category is called its intensity or saturation. And intensity or saturation is difficult to talk about because words don't do it justice. Intensity is a function of color's relative brightness or dullness, but not its lightness or darkness. Um, it's kind of like its spiciness. The intensity or saturation of a color is really kind of its spiciness. Um, if you ever buy a dress or a blazer that's in a kind of a brilliant electric blue, we would say that jacket has a very, very high intensity. The colors are just vivid and they're again I want to use the word intensity and saturation rather than brightness because brightness might be confused with amount of white you add to a painting. If you add white to a color and turn red into pink, that's not going to have a lot of intensity because the pink is actually going to be kind of dull, like pastel Easter colors are kind of dull. Um, Intensity is the amount of actual uh, pigment in the color, an intense, rich pigment in the color. The intensity, again, I think a nice way is to call it its electricness or its spiciness, and that's the saturation or intensity. This is Leonardo da Vinci's uh, Sistine Chapel ceiling, and a nice way to explain saturation and intensity will be by comparing the unrestored version after 500 years of people burning candles beneath it and putting coats of varnish and shellac on it, doing these kind of crappy restorations. We're going to compare the unrestored version to the restored version. And what I want to keep you in mind is this is a great way of describing intensity because the colors in this unrestored painting are you still see the hue. Here we see in the center, we see Adam and God. God's coming to give life to Adam. Um, Under God's left arm, he has Eve. He hasn't made Eve yet. This is the moment of the creation of Adam. Eve comes a little later on. So as God floats by, he's going to create Eve later on. He's going to touch Adam's finger, and Adam's going to be given life. You can see Adam is laying down on the earth, and he's sitting on a kind of a green field, and there's a little bit of blue behind him. And God's wearing kind of a slightly faded purple garment as he floats by, right? And all these colors are there, and they have a certain hue. We can name the colors. We can also name the degree of value of light and shade, because it still looks well modeled, and Adam seems volumetric, and Eve and God, they're all well modeled and represented. We could even say that chiaroscuro is there, and that we can see that degree of modeling of the form. So we have light and shade, we have the hues, we have all that, but we don't really understand intensity until we see the cleaned work. I'll cut to that next. So here's the restored work. They scraped away all the candle wax and all the shellac and all the kind of crappy restorations people had done over the 500 years. And now you can see how the intensity of the painting has been turned up, like the electricity or the volume has been turned up. They're spicier now. The colors are richer. Again, they're not lighter or darker. They're just more intense. And hopefully that comparison between the unrestored and then the cleaned version, which hopefully looks like the original, gives you an understanding of what color intensity means. You know it when you buy kind of a vivid pair of pants or a vivid piece of clothing, and the colors are just brilliant and intense. They're not lighter. You need another word to describe them. They're not lighter or darker. They're more full of saturation or intensity. And again, that's the third way of describing color. You've got hue first, which is the overall color category, which color you would assign it to on the color wheel, and then you've got its value, whether it's faded or it's dark. It can be pink or it can be maroon, faded or deep. And then you've got this other thing, this more elusive in description, this intensity or saturation, which has to do with its kind of vibrantness or its saturation. I said spicy and electric. I think those are good words to describe this thing called saturation and intensity. And again, a great example is in comparing Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel before it was cleaned and after. So again, the excellent example of the impact of change in intensity is seen in the newly restored Sistine Chapel ceiling, It's painted by Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512, and restorers discovered that the dull, somber tones that were always associated with Michelangelo's palette um, were not his at all, and that after years and years, hundreds of years of accumulated dust, smoke, and lots of grease from all the candles that were lit below. Because remember, in the Renaissance, there's no electricity, so the only way to illuminate a room is through an oil lamp or candles, and all that candles stuff rises up and just kind of create a lot of soot over the painting. Anyway, the art restorers revealed this incredibly intense color beneath all that soot and dirt, and lots of experts were just shocked because there'd already been, of course, 400 years of art history written about the paintings and about Michelangelo's, somber use of colors and whatnot. But they were writing about the wrong thing. They were writing about a work of art that Michelangelo never painted. They were writing about a dirty old painting. And now that they've seen these brilliant, vibrant ones, what was already considered a masterpiece became more so a masterpiece. I use the term palette. Um, a palette is the thing a painter holds in his hand when he makes a painting, and that's the physical thing, a palette. But the idea of a palette is the range of colors that an artist purposely selects for a painting. Your palette is simply the colors you use when you make a painting. You've heard the term perhaps discussed when you go to eat dinner, and a baby has an unrefined palate, and as you get older, your culinary palate becomes more and more refined. You're able to taste the difference between different foods. Children like salty foods and sweet foods because they're simple foods for the palate to uh, differentiate. As you get older, you have a more sensitive palate. If you're a cigarette smoker, then your palate gets diminished, and you can't differentiate between different kinds of food. Anyway, that same word can be applied to color. The palette that an artist uses are the colors that an artist presents. We'll talk now about color schemes. Color schemes are simply the colors that an artist, or in this case a painter, employs in different ways to achieve a wide variety of effects. An analogous color scheme is a color scheme where you're using hues that neighbor each other on the color wheel. So you're using colors that neighbor one another. Analogous means colors that are next to each other on the color wheel, or hues that are next to each other on the color wheel. Because again, now you can use different intensities of those colors, and you can use different values of those colors. But the hue itself. So the color scheme, um, one of the principal color schemes that we talk about is the color temperature. This painting by Sanford Gifford, October in the Catskills, we see yellows and oranges and reds that we would normally associate with the color temperature warm. We'd say these are warm colors. Greens and blues and violets are considered cool. The colors of fire are red, yellow, and orange. The colors of water and ice are considered, blue, green, and violet. So, again, in Sanford Gifford's October in the Catskills, we see the artist employing yellows and oranges to incite this feeling of warmth. Just as warm or cool palettes can elicit psychological sensations, Romare Bearden, in the next work of art, has created kind of a cool blue and green palette. So again, the prior painting we would say is a warm palette where he's using analogous yellow and orange, warm colors. And here we're seeing blue and green, also analogous colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And we see this, but Bearden has surrounded his kind of cool central object with contrasting warm red, yellow, and orange to create this overall color scheme. Um, when a color scheme is composed of hues that lie on opposite ends of the color wheel, we call that complementary. Orange and blue are complementary colors. Red and green are complementary colors. When two complements appear in the same composition placed next to one another, they will appear brighter than if they're used alone. This is important. So again, if two complementary colors appear in the same composition, and if they're especially placed right next to one another, they will appear brighter than if they're used alone. This effect is called simultaneous contrast, and it's due to the physiological way your eye works. The eye supplies an after image of a given hue that of the color that's complemented. So Here's this kind of grotesque painting by Leon Golub called The Mercenaries. Mercenaries are paid soldiers. Mercenaries are paid killers. Mercenaries are people who are given money to join a war and to kill people not for patriotic reasons or for nationalistic reasons, but they kill people for money. To emphasize this expressive notion of the paid killer, Leon Golub has this huge field of blood red painted on the wall, and then these kind of scarred up guys wearing their green camouflage clothing. Um, so this is an example of a complementary color scheme where we see uh, simultaneous contrast in effect. Because if you stare at a field of red long enough, so if you guys want to do the experiment, you can stare at this red painting for a long time. Stare at this painting without blinking for 30 seconds. If you just stare at this painting for 30 seconds without blinking, and then quickly turn away and look at a white wall or a blank wall, you should see not red, but you should see green. There should be a green after image left on your eye. And that's this physical phenomenon called simultaneous contrast. It's just this the eye supplies an after image of the color. So again, when you see red and green together, they're complementary colors, and they add to each other's intensity. You get a greater overall intensity of each color. Complementary color scheme. It's not just red and green. It can be orange, blue. It can be yellow, purple. This is Sunday on La Grande Jatte by Georges Seurat. This is a painting that attempts to harmonize complementary colors. Seurat painted thousands of tiny dots on the canvas to make this painting, and he coined the term pointillism. By using these tiny, tiny, tiny dots of near primary colors, kind of raw colors, um, the eye mixes the colors together. Um, Again, he didn't mix his paint on the palette, but rather he used tiny dots of pure color right on the canvas. And this relies on a phenomenon called optical mixing, so that when you get really close to the painting, it looks blurry, but when you get further away, your eyes mix the colors together, and you get this overall feeling. It creates kind of a murkiness, but also kind of a really atmospheric sense for the painting. Again, the closer you are to the painting, the more it looks like abstract dots, but the farther away you move, it becomes far more representational. This is optical mixing, specifically pointillism. To further confuse you, and I will not quiz you on this, so don't commit this to study. But there's a guy named Munsell who felt that the color wheel was inadequate. Um, it's kind of screwy, but Munsell felt that the color green wasn't a secondary color. So he was of the opinion that green was a primary color. And he felt that way in part because there's so much green in nature. And he also felt that way, and bear with me, I'll try to describe this. It's kind of a philosophical idea. But he felt that green didn't seem to be the child of yellow and blue. He felt that green was its own color, and that it didn't have that much in common with yellow or blue. If you look at orange or red yellow, I mean, if you mix red and yellow together, you get orange, and that kind of red yellow, which we see here in the color wheel, what we would call orange. It looks a lot like the son or child of red and yellow, and the same would go for blue violet or for red violet. Um, Moncel is arguing that green is a primary color. It's abundant in nature, and that it doesn't seem like it's the child of yellow and blue the same way the other secondary colors do. Again, this is just his own theory, um, and he felt that if we worked with this, we would have a better understanding of things. And he was a big color theorist in 1905, and he created this color wheel with the five primary hues. And anyway, again, I won't quiz you on this, but just another point of view. This Feather Mask from 1960 shows us, again, many of the powerful complementary color relationships that are at play, creating that kind of intensity. We saw The Mercenaries by Leon Golub, and I talked about simultaneous contrast because we had red-green. Well, here we get simultaneous contrast through, I would say, through orange-blue or yellow-purple. So the intensity of the colors is increased by complementary colors being presented. Here's a detail of a painting by a contemporary painter named Chuck Close. Chuck Close made his oil painting called Stanley, and it could be described in way as kind of pointillism, like we saw from George Seurat. Like all of Chuck Close's work, the piece is based on a photograph. The artist takes a photograph, and then he puts a grid on his paper, and then he paints very carefully these little squares, and he uses complementary colors or disharmonious little squares. And if you zoomed in even further, you'd see these little squares are kind of like almost like red blood cells, like bagel shapes in there in each square. Anyway, it appears kind of abstract or non-objective here, and certainly if you got even closer, it would be non-objective. So it's kind of, if you zoomed in even further, it'd be non-objective. At this level, it seems kind of like an abstraction. But then if we zoom out and see the whole work together, and I'll show you that now, now we see that it's a highly representational work of art, and it looks exactly like the subject, down to the glare on his eyeglasses. Again, viewed up close, the work is hard to see, and if you imagine getting really, really close to it, it would look like this series of concentric circles and kind of like pure abstraction, non-objective art. But as the viewer moves further away, the design of the squares dissolves, and the subject Stanley's features become visible with greater and greater clarity. Chuck Close relates the process of working on such a painting to playing golf, through the notion of moving from the general to the specific, from teeing off to the final putting for the green. That's kind of a quote. That's how Chuck Close feels his work operates. In Stanley, Chuck Close reveals a rare knowledge of the optical effects of color mixing. He's also, in effect, accomplishing two things. The work is fully representational when viewed from a distance, and fully abstract, almost non-objective, when viewed up close. And that's exciting. I can't jump back because I'm moving forward in my lecture, but if you can jump back now to see them, you'll understand the point a little better. So, we're talking about color schemes, and here's another kind. When artists work with either analogous or complementary color schemes, they limit the range of their color selections. If you work with analogous color schemes, it's only colors that neighbor you, only hues that are next door to one color on the color wheel. For complementary color schemes, you work with colors that are opposite you. But what about this painting, Feelers for Sale by Charles Searles? Here he's rejected any of those ideas, and he's working with what we call a polychromatic color scheme. And that means he's employing the entire range of hues in a wide variety of values and intensities. He's got it all going on here. This painting is we call this polychromatic. If all the colors are there, it's polychromatic. You may remember from high school geometry, a polygon is a multi-sided figure. Well, polychromatic means multicolored. And he's got a multicolored painting here where everything goes. It becomes pretty exciting. Let's talk about color in representational art. There are four different ways of using color in representational art. An artist can represent local color, perceptual color, optical mixing, like Seurat, or simply use arbitrary color. And we'll talk about those. In fact, I'll state them again. Four different ways of using color in representational painting or art. Local color, perceptual color, you can create optical mixing, and then you can use arbitrary color. So first, Stuart Davis, Summer Landscape, and this is a great example of local color. Local color, like its name implies, are the colors that you would symbolically associate with the thing. If you were in kindergarten and you were painting a tree, you'd paint the leaves green because green is the color of leaves. It's kind of the symbolic color, the color we've kind of indexically connected to the thing. Water is blue, sky is blue, Leaves are green, an apple might be red. Those are the colors. Bricks are maroon. Those are the colors that we assign to something um, symbolically or indexically. They're the colors that we would associate with something. If we closed our eyes and someone said, what color is a brick? You'd say reddish brown. Or what color is a leaf? You'd say green. Well, when you use this kind of color scheme in a work of art, I'm sorry, not color scheme, this kind of color system, we call it local color. This is the color system called local color. Here we see Claude Monet's grain stack at sunset. Earlier in the semester, we saw one, I think, on a snowy day. And this is an example of an impressionist painter, but here's an example of perceptual color, and that is employing the colors that things appear to be dependent upon the light, the time of the season, and the overall atmospheric conditions. Monet painted his subjects outdoors, inspiring the French term plein air painting, which means open air. Monet did not simply paint a grain stack yellow, the color of straw, but rather combine the colors that he perceived at that moment on that site. So, again, if Stuart Davis made this painting, he would have painted using a local color system. He would have painted the hay yellow and the sky blue and the grass green. But through this perceptual color and through plein air painting, through painting out of doors and being there in the moment and carefully observing what's going on, Monet has found that sure, there's some blue in the sky, but he's also got it kind of bending into a yellow and then into kind of a fleshy pink. Um, he's painting the way things look at that moment, the way he perceives them through keen observation at the moment. So again, Monet uses perceptual color quite differently from Seurat's optical color. George Seurat, the guy who made the park painting, that's an example of optical color mixing because there the colors rely on the phenomenon of your eye to blend and separate the colors. I'm sorry, to blend separate colors together. Gerhard Richter is a contemporary painter, German born, and this piece is pretty exciting. It's called 256 colors, and it's just that. It's a grid of enamel on canvas. What Richter's done is he's gone to like a paint store like Sherman-Williams or I don't know, Home Depot, and he's picked up a whole bunch of these little color swatches, those little colors you might use before you repaint a room in your house and you're thinking about what color to make it. And then he copied the colors and he painted them in this grid. And what happened was, again, this painting belongs to a series of chromatic charts they made in the 60s. There was this tricking of the eye that happened here. Where the vertical and the horizontal white lines intersect, there's a gray kind of retinal pop. Yet, if you stare at this painting, the intersecting white lines, you'll see little gray squares. But then when you go to stare at those little gray squares, they vanish. So it's this kind of weird optical game where you look at this painting and these little gray squares appear. The gray squares again are at the intersecting points of the white lines, vertical and horizontal lines. And then when you go to stare at those gray squares, they vanish, and then they reappear in other places. In this kind of bizarre effect, they only seem to appear when you're not looking for them. It's kind of in your peripheral vision thing. Kind of tricks your eye. Anyway, it's pretty exciting color phenomenon. Or optical phenomenon, I suppose. Here's a Pierre Bonnard painting from the 1930s. And this is an example of what we call arbitrary color. Arbitrary color is a situation where an artist uses colors that are not true, either to optical or local colors, and just makes up colors for their own expressive ends. So again, we see a purple tree and an orange apple, and these are not examples of colors studied through studying nature carefully, as it would be in by Monet, or local colors, as it would be from Stuart Davis, because there's no purple trees. We call this arbitrary color, and that is when an artist makes things, subjects in their painting, any color they like, sheerly for expressive ends. So again, this is the final system. We had four of them. So in review, the four color systems we just talked about were local color, where Stuart Davis painted water blue and leaves green. Perceptual color, and we saw Claude Monet paint the sky not at all blue and the grain stack not at all yellow, but rather he used the subtle colors that he discovered while he was making the painting. Plein air painting, painting out of doors. Then we had optical color mixing, which was going way back to George Seurat and his little dots of pure color that kind of mix together to give you color. And maybe we could say the same for Gerhard Richter's 256 colors. There's some optical mixing going on there. And then finally, the Bonnard painting we see in front of us, where we have arbitrary color. Trees are not purple. Arbitrary color seen here. Those are four color systems. Not color schemes, but rather color systems. Sonia Delaney Turk, along with her husband Robert Delaney, was a founder of modern abstract painting, and in Paris in the early 20th century they explored the colors of the modern world. For both artists, these colors assumed the shapes of discs, and Robert called these simultaneous discs based on his notion about the simultaneous contrast of colors. He sought in his paintings to balance complements in giant color wheels, and Sonia was less scientific in her approach to the design. In 1913, Delaney began to make what she called simultaneous dresses, reflecting her observations of halos of electric streetlights and their effect on color. Her dresses were soon lauded for the dynamic uses of colors that moved as the body moved. The writer Blaise Cendrars was so inspired by Sonia's color sense that he asked her to illustrate his long poem called The Prose of the Trans-Siberian. So she illustrated the poem, and Delaney experienced what she called her simultaneous colors, and her discoveries led to Electric Prism, the painting we see here. The title of the poem and other phrases appear in the center left of the painting. In the Electric Prism, the circular discs and the color combinations she had seen in electric light and her husband's simultaneous discs kind of reappear, and the movement of the colors and the flowing lines that she has designed in the dresses are all kind of here. After her first year of studying art in Paris, she had come to believe, as she put it, quote, colors can heighten our sense of ourselves and our notion of with the universe, end quote. In the colors of Electric Prism, which we see here, she believed she had joined herself to the flux and the flow and to the energy and the dynamism of modern art and modern life itself. So again, an example of an artist pretty excited about the use of color, especially 100 years ago. Now we're going to talk about the symbolic use of color. The symbolic use of color. This is a Van Gogh painting, and we're going to see a Kandinsky painting next. To different people, colors symbolize different things. For instance, when we see a stoplight, we assume that everyone understands that red means stop and that green means go. However, in China, this distinction does not exist. They don't have red lights in China. In the context of war, the color red symbolizes blood. And in the context of Valentine's Day, the color red might symbolize love. So again, symbolic color, color is symbolic, but it seems like there's a lot of open-endedness to it, you know. Here's The Night Cafe by Vincent van Gogh, and it employs red and green to Van Gogh's expressive ends. In a letter to his brother Theo, Vincent van Gogh wrote that he was trying to present the complements of green and red in this imbalance. Quote, Van Gogh says, quote, everywhere there is a clash and contrast of the most ardent red and greens. So Van Gogh is trying to paint what he calls the emotion of an ardent temperament. Van Gogh's use of kind of dissonant complementary color schemes, such as red and green here, demonstrate that effect of his color. It's called the Night Cafe, and again, people at night at the bar are, in a bad way. We see on the right hand side of the painting, we see two guys kind of with their hands on their elbows, their faces on their elbows, kind of just slumped over, probably drunk. We got another guy on the left all by himself. In the rear upper left hand corner, you've got a couple kind of sitting there having a couple of drinks. A bunch of tables with half empty drinks. People have gone home, and then you've got the night cafe owner standing there in front of his billiards table. Um, again, the night cafe is a place where you're kind of seeing the dark side of society, and by using these what Van Gogh called the clash and contrast of the most alien reds and greens into the emotion of an ardent temperament. He's trying to make this kind of thing happen. So he's using red and greens to demonstrate this kind of dark side of life. Let's compare this to Kandinsky's paintings with more or less the same color scheme. Here's a Kandinsky painting called Black Lines. Just to give you a little refresher course, the prior painting by Van Gogh was highly representational. It looked like a place with people sitting down. This painting is non-objective by Kandinsky. We'd call this non-objective. It's just the paint there, just the design that we see in front of us. It makes no reference to the outside world. This is beyond abstraction because it's not an abstraction of anything. Anyway, Kandinsky's using the same color scheme as Van Gogh, but he's saying that he felt that his symbolic use of these colors were blue for heavenly, the color of heaven, yellow, the color of the earth, and red to stimulate the heart. And he's going on about how harmony of red and green are very charming. And again, this is in direct contrast to Van Gogh, who saw that same combination of red and green as showing him the power of darkness, the dark side. So again, the point that the author is making and the point that I'm making in Lecture 7 about the symbolic use of color is it's really only relative to the way it's used in the specific work of art. You can't say that red means this or green means that, but rather it's the way they're presented overall that become the important part. Let's have a look at our final image for Lecture 7. It's by a British sculptor named Tony Krog. Here's Tony Krog's sculpture. It's called Newton's Tones, New Stones, kind of a tongue twister. And Sir Isaac Newton is the guy who is responsible for He's the guy who sat under the tree and the apple fell on his head. So he kind of he didn't invent gravity, but he kind of did a lot of thinking and understanding about gravity. He also came up with the visual prism, did some optical work as well. Anyway, Tony Krog has made this sculpture, which sits on the floor, and it's pretty big. It's like 6 by 15 feet. And it's an assemblage, a kind of sculpture made out of pieces that have been assembled. And you can see that it's very, very colorful. In fact, you see the whole spectrum in this work of art. This spectrum is, however, not made with paint, but rather Tony Krog, who lives in England on the beach, walks on the beach each day, and he picks up little scraps of discarded plastic, driftwood, not driftwood, drift plastic, I suppose, little pieces of garbage that have floated by. He picks them up and he brings them home, and then he puts them in little containers or bins, and then he takes them all here and he's presenting them from the purple on the far left, moving into the red, to the orange, into yellow, yellow, green, green, moving towards green, blue, to blue, and then finally back to violet, which would then continue back on the other side. So he's presenting us the spectrum, and he's doing it with kind of found garbage. This kind of the new beach litter is these little plastic pieces that look like lids from plastic containers and laundry detergent and who knows what other little bits. But again, the artist here, Tony Krog, was not just trained as an artist but also as a scientist, and he's reinventing here Newton's color spectrum, that we learn about with white light passing through the spectrum. Here we have to think about these stones, these plastic toys, and these kitchen implements, and these broken containers that Tony Krog has collected on the beach in Sussex, England. And again, the artist is forcing us to consider the idea of chroma and color and litter and ecology, and how you can make something very beautiful out of something very ugly, discarded beach trash, which would destroy the environment. And then here, through his contextualization, he's presenting it as, I think, a very sublime and thoughtful work of art. But again, this work of art is only relative because it talks about light and color and the organization and the reorganization of light and color. So this concludes lecture 7 on light and color.